public session. Scrutiny of EU legislative proposals. Schedule B. COM 2019-238, COM 2019-239, COM 2019-241, COM 2019-245, COM 2019-265. It is proposed that these proposals do not warrant further scrutiny. Is that agreed? Agreed. In today's meeting, we meet with Sarah Merrill from Justice for Colombia, Mariella Cohn, Kevin Cannon, General Secretary, Forces Trade Union, and David Joyce, International Officer at ICTU, to discuss the implementation of the peace process in Colombia. You're very welcome here today, and I thank you for providing the briefing material in advance. I also welcome the Ambassador of Colombia here to our meeting this morning as well. Before we begin, can I remind members, witnesses and persons in the public gallery to turn off their mobile phones. Members too are requested to ensure that for the duration of the meeting the mobile phones are turned off completely or switched to airplane safe or flight mode depending on their device. It is not sufficient for members or those in attendance to just put their phones in silent mode, as this will cause interference with the broadcasting system. By virtue of Section 17(2)(l) of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence to the Joint Committee. If they are directed by the Chairman to cease giving evidence on a particular matter and continue to do so, they are entitled thereafter only to qualified privilege in respect of their evidence. They are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and they are asked to respect the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against any person or body outside the Houses or an official, either by name or in such a way as to make him, her or it identifiable. I now call on Mr Cannon and Ms Cohn to make opening statements. Mr Cannon.
Thank you for the opportunity to meet with you today and to listen to what we have to say about the situation in Colombia. I am the Senior General Secretary Designate of Forsa, which, as you know, is Ireland's second largest trade union with more than 80,000 members. I am also one of the two Vice Presidents of the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, having been re-elected last week at the Biennial Delegate Conference. Justice for Colombia is an NGO wholly owned by the British and Irish trade union movement. I currently serve as one of the Irish members of its governing body. In my capacity as ICTU Vice President, I visited Colombia during late November and early December 2016. During the week in which I was there, the peace agreement between the Colombian government and the FARC, which had been renegotiated following its narrow rejection in a plebiscite the previous September, was ratified by the Congress in Bogotá. I was accompanied by the then President of ICTU, two Westminster MPs, a number of senior British trade union leaders, an eminent lawyer and a well-known journalist. Our intensive schedule included a range of meetings in Bogotá with a variety of human rights and social justice campaigners, the leadership of the main trade union federation, the CUT, relatives of the disappeared and key leaders of the FARC. We then travelled to Buenaventura, the main Colombian port through which 60% of trade passes. Here we visited some of the outer suburban slums where people who had been displaced to make way for the expansion of the port were housed. We also saw some of the infamous chop houses in the port area itself, where those abducted by paramilitary gangs were dismembered prior to their body parts being scattered in the ocean. Following a journey to the city of Cali, we travelled into rural and mountainous Cauca. Here, over the course of a day, we heard the testimonies of around 200 rural dwellers, some of whom had travelled long journeys to meet with us. As this location was one of the designated zones for the reincorporation of FARC combatants, we also met the local commanders before proceeding to meet with the army leaders, including 3 colonels who were stationed in nearby barracks. On return to Bogotá, our group divided, with some travelling to Chiquinquira prison, where a large number of FARC prisoners were being held. I was part of the small group who visited Uber Ballesteros in La Picota prison. He is a trade union leader who at that time had been in prison for more than 3 years. Prior to returning home, I also met with members of the Congressional Peace Commission and the Presidential Councillor for Human Rights with 3 of our staff. Some of the delegation met with the British ambassador and his officials. The foregoing is not an exhaustive list, but it will give you a flavour of the range of the contacts made and the distance travelled over 6 days in Colombia. I'm pleased to say that following my return to Ireland, Uber Ballesteros was released from prison, and on my proposal he was invited to attend and to address the ICTU Biennial Delegate Conference that took place in July 2017 in Belfast. It was an emotional moment and one that was fittingly recognised when the President of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins, addressed him personally during his speech to the conference. The Colombian Peace Agreement contains 6 main pillars. These relate to comprehensive rural reform, which seeks to help rural communities gain access to land and to formalise land titles, to access the means to make this land productive and to participate in the planning of their regions. Political participation, which seeks to open up the democratic space and to guarantee rights for the political opposition, to reform an electoral process and to guarantee that politicians and weapons are no longer used together. End of conflict, which seeks to carry out the FARC's disarmament, to guarantee FARC members' transition into civilian life and their political, social and economic reincorporation, and to dismantle paramilitary groups and to guarantee secure conditions for former combatants and communities. Solution to the problem of illicit drugs, which seeks to help illicit crop growers transition to legal activity through the implementation of a crop substitution programme, to facilitate treatment for consumers and to fight against the entire chain of drug trafficking. Victims, which seeks to establish a truth commission to clarify what happened during the conflict, to bring about justice regarding crimes committed by all actors during the conflict with a focus on truth and restorative justice, to establish a special unit to find the disappeared and to bring about a comprehensive reparation for victims and guarantee that these events will never happen again. And implementation and verification, which seeks that the peace agreement is implemented to ensure that a commission of 3 senior government and 3 FARC members is established to follow up the implementation process and to ensure that the implementation is accompanied internationally by several institutions and organisations and verified by a UN special political verification mission. I was struck by important similarities to the Irish peace process. While there are differences, it is clear that the journey to peace has had many similar elements in both countries. Indeed, Irish politicians from all sides, particularly in the north, played an important role in assisting the Colombian process. Justice for Colombia was centrally involved in the coordination of this effort. I was also struck by the importance of the land question in Colombia, and comparison can be made to the way in which land played an important role in Irish history, particularly towards the end of the 19th century. Since my return from Colombia, I've continued to work with Justice for Colombia, including, as I have said, serving as one of the Irish members of the governing body. In 2017, my own union, Forza, through our Developing World Fund, agreed to support the establishment of a JFC Peace Monitor. This work commenced in 2017 and is continuing in an effort to spread awareness about the situation in Colombia so as to help trade unionists and other social leaders there. 2 further high-level visits to Colombia have taken place. These delegations again comprised parliamentarians, senior trade unionists and lawyers. 2 of my senior colleagues have participated, and on both occasions they have confirmed the value and importance of these visits, not just because of the effect on morale for Colombian trade unionists and human rights defenders, but also because of the unique access to and exchanges with Colombian institutions and state agencies. Since the peace agreement was ratified, there has been an upsurge in the level of attacks, threats, intimidation and murder of civil society activists and human rights defenders. You will hear more detail about the scale of this later. I want to acknowledge the efforts of the EU Special Envoy, Eamon Gilmore, who has played a hugely important, influential role in the peace process itself. I also want to take note of the input of Irish officials during the extended peace talks in Havana. The recent opening of an Irish embassy in Bogotá and the appointment of Ambassador Alison Milton should also be acknowledged. The situation in Colombia is grave. As we know, in this country, peace is fragile and requires constant effort to ensure the necessary balance of measures that are required to sustain a peace agreement once it has been negotiated. It is a source of serious worry that elements of the Colombian peace agreement have been ignored, changed or progressed too slowly. Our experience on this island means that we have a special responsibility to assist peace efforts and to point out unacceptable practices. but all the while speaking out for the oppressed and those who seek to defend or advocate for them. Colombia is the most dangerous country in the world to be a trade unionist. Human rights defenders regularly encounter violence and death. Civil society activists operate in fear of their lives. Your interest and action as legislators and parliamentarians can make a difference. Justice for Colombia is a very small NGO, but it has unique access to and credibility with a wide range of actors in Colombia. My colleague Mariela Cohen served as its director for many years, was then an advisor in the peace process from 2016 to 2018, prior to taking up an appointment as the senior international officer at the British TUC earlier this year. I will let her inform you about the path to the peace agreement itself, the difficult situation since it was ratified, and the current situation that pertains in Colombia.
Thank you, Mr. Cannon. Ms. Cohen.
Thank you very much. The situation in Colombia is critical. The peace agreement signed in November 2016 between the FARC and the Colombian government is facing huge challenges, and more so since the election of President Iván Duque. The implementation of the agreement has been slow, and there have been attempts to change the agreement by the current administration. The implementation of the chapters dealing with the root causes of the conflict, comprehensive rural reform and political participation have seen little progress. The chapters dealing with the consequences have been subject to attempts to change their nature and have been under-resourced by the state. The current government, led by President Iván Duque, is from a party, Centro Democrático, which has openly attacked the peace agreement and challenges the transitional justice model as agreed, which would affect the rights of all victims of the conflict. He was elected on such a platform, and the polarisation seen during the election remains. As mentioned, I'm currently the Senior International Officer at the TUC. Between 2016 and 2018, I was an advisor in the peace process, liaising with the international mechanisms established to verify the implementation of the agreement, the UN verification mission and the Security Council and other mechanisms. I participated in the negotiations and advised in the CICIVI, the Implementation and Monitoring Oversight Commission, made up of 3 government ministers and 3 FARC representatives. Prior to this, I was Director of Justice for Colombia and led an initiative to take cross-party representatives involved in negotiating the Good Friday Agreement and trade unionists to share their experiences in Colombia and Havana during the process. The agreement was not for the benefit of the FARC, but for all the people of Colombia. Whilst the FARC have complied with their obligations, their disarmament was verified by the UN verification mission. They have appeared before the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, the transitional justice process known by its Spanish acronym HEP. The government has not implemented crucial areas of the agreement, attempted to change the HEP scope, and we have seen a huge and alarming number of social leaders and former FARC combatants assassinated with little effective action taken by the government. At the heart of the agreement is the transitional justice process, including the HEP, as well as a Truth Commission and a unit to search for the disappeared. The HEP has been subject to repeated attacks by the ruling party, attempts to change its scope, and undermined by the former Attorney General. Despite this, the HEP has heard several cases since it started to work. Case 001 related to kidnappings. The whole former leadership of the FARC appeared before the court. Case 002 related to acts of war. Case 004 related to the humanitarian situation in Urabá, and Case 007 about the recruitment of minors is being prepared. Both the Parliament and the Constitutional Court excluded the mandatory jurisdiction of the HEP over civilian state agents, politicians and public administrators, and third parties, funders and organisers of paramilitary groups, limiting the mandatory jurisdiction to just former combatants, members of the public security forces, and former guerrillas. The attacks on the system raises the question whether there are sectors afraid of the truth being revealed and afraid of putting an end to the impunity many have enjoyed for decades. On March 10, 2019, the President expressed 6 objections to the draft statutory law of the HEP. The international community strongly pronounced their support for the law, and finally, on April 8th, the government's objections were rejected by Congress. The HEP has received significant international support. Repeated Security Council sessions on Colombia have called for its autonomy to be respected. The UN Secretary-General, in a press statement to announce the publication of the UN Verification Mission's latest report, stated that I quote, "I call upon all parties to ensure that any reforms undertaken respect the commitments made to those who lay down their arms in good faith and on the basis of provisions in the peace agreement, a principle that the Security Council has itself underscored." There is also concern over funding for the system. The Truth Commission is lacking crucial resources and it's seen itself forced to rely on international support for its functioning. The chapter of the agreement dealing with political participation, where political exclusion and a lack of democratic space has been recognised as the cause of the conflict, has several areas which haven't been implemented. Crucially, the 16 seats in the House of Representatives agreed for civil society representatives from the regions most affected by the conflict have not been established. In the areas of comprehensive rural reform, there is also slow progress. The government's own National Development Plan sees less than 1% of its budget dedicated to investment in the countryside. One of the main concerns for peasant organisations is the creation of the strategic zones of comprehensive intervention, which many people perceive as a return to the old war on drugs, where the main responsibility in terms of eradication of crops will fall on the Ministry of Defence. This is far removed from the measures stipulated in the peace agreement. Many compare these zones to the consolidation areas, which were areas of military control and operation under the previous Uribe administration, raising concerns about the potential for human rights abuses. The security conditions of those who work in the programme to substitute illicit crops is worrying. There are reports of around 50 murdered so far. The President has announced intentions to return to fumigation of crops, which cause huge environmental damage, health risks, and goes against the roadmap established in the peace agreement to deal with the problem of coca and other crops for illicit use in a sustainable way. The situation of reincorporation of former combatants remains concerning. There is still an urgent need to purchase land. Support for the areas for training and reincorporation are due to finish in August 2019. The uncertainty caused by the lack of economic reincorporation, combined with the killings of former combatants, creates a worrying panorama. According to the FARC, 135 former members have been murdered and 11 forcibly disappeared. And I have to say, since I wrote this statement, 2 more were killed just in the last 3 days. One of the most recent to be killed was Dimar Torres, a FARC member who is alleged to have been murdered by a Colombian soldier, who then appears to have intended to forcibly disappear his body. A recent statement by the UN Special Rapporteur on Extrajudicial Executions and the UN Working Group on Enforced Disappearances urged the Colombian government, quote, to cease inciting violence against demobilised individuals of the FARC-EP and to meet the guarantees that were made to them during the negotiations in Havana, most importantly, the respect of the right to life. The minister responsible for peace implementation, Emilio Archila, reacted by calling their statement badly intentioned and rejected their conclusions. The UN Verification Mission's report, covering the period March 26 to June 26, stated that during just this period, 14 former FARC members were killed, including the second recorded killing of a former female combatant, Lucero Jaramillo Alvarez, on the 4th of April. The figures of killings of human rights defenders and social leaders is similarly alarming. Figures vary. Some human rights organisations estimate that since the signing of the peace agreement in November 2016, 591 social leaders have been assassinated. 193 of these in the last 10 months since President Duque took office. These include human rights defenders, trade unionists, social leaders, community leaders promoting coca crop substitution, and others defending the process. A human rights monitoring programme, Somos Defensores, identified that between January and March there were 245 different aggressive acts against human rights defenders, a 66% increase from the same period last year. The ITUC's just published Global Rights Index shows that 34 trade unionists were killed in Colombia last year, meaning the majority of trade unionists killed in the world are Colombian, with little action being taken to bring those responsible to justice. It is listed as amongst the 10 worst countries to be a worker and where workers have no guarantee of rights. This all occurs in the context of upcoming local elections in October this year. The non-governmental electoral observation mission warned in a May 27th report that violence and intimidation against local candidates may increase during this period. It noted that already incidents against potential candidates are 50% higher than in the equivalent period in previous local elections in 2015. Despite the challenges, many brave Colombians remain committed to the peace process. The current situation in Colombia means the role of the international community is increasingly crucial if we want to see a lasting and sustainable peace. The peace agreement was signed not just by the Santos administration, but by the Colombian state. It's an official document circulated in the UN Security Council, and the state, regardless of the ruling party opinion, has an obligation to implement it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentations, both Mr. Cannon and Ms. Cohen. Deputy Maureen O'Sullivan.
Thank you very much, and you're very welcome, and good to see you again, Mariella. I think it's very timely. I was struck what you said there about sectors afraid of the truth, and at the moment we are debating, just last night, a bill here that would see increased information being given from this state to Northern Ireland in relation to the Good Friday Agreement peace process, etc. And there's no doubt that there are people who are afraid of the truth and they're afraid to accept, what goes on. So we're seeing here what you're reporting on there. And also timely because I see the report from Christian A this morning about illicit drugs in Colombia, Myanmar and Bangladesh. They did say that there were progressive elements in the peace process to deal with this, but the progress is not being made. So that's my first one. What's needed to get that move, to get that moving? I want to acknowledge that, the Ambassador does come in and gives us updates on the implementation of the peace process and acknowledges the areas that are very, very slow and the areas that are continuing. I think you mentioned the point about the visits, and it's good that you have that access to so many institutions and agencies when you're there. So the question then is, in spite of the negatives and the grim situation you paint, are you getting the sense, this desire to implement the peace process? And, where are the blocks? Where are the real blocks, the obstacles to that? And you might just refer back to the role of the paramilitary groups and those who have not come into that. We know that how difficult it is for a country to come out of a conflict situation with massive loss of life and the way in which it has affected everywhere. So I can see the conflict in that context as well. But these attacks and the murders, the massacre of trade unionists, of civil society leaders and so on. So why do you think there isn't enough protection of those groups? Who's stopping that protection? Why are there so many murders allowed to happen? Because obviously these leaders in their communities are known. So why is there not a protection regime for those people? And again, it was good in yours, Mariella, that the Colombians remain committed to the peace process. The role of the international community is the other one. It's good we have an ambassador there, and the visits that she's also getting, and she was over recently and we met her and we were hearing about what's going on. But I suppose if there was one particular thing you would change to bring about a drive for a just peace, what would that be? Thanks, Chair.
Deputy Sullivan. Ms. Cohen.
Thanks, Maureen. So just on that point of the truth, something that happened since I wrote the intervention is that the government announced a 30% cut to the budget for the whole transitional truth and justice process. The HEP has said that's going to be very difficult. The Truth Commission has said that's going to stop it being able to function. The Unit for the Disappeared as well is going to have to cut several of its areas. Already they're having to rely on international support. So one concrete thing would be to pressure the government to give enough resources to that system. On the coca issue, there is a roadmap in the peace agreement for that. That's not being kept to in the sense that aerial fumigations, which the government has announced an intention to return to, they've shown to be ineffective, and also they cause huge damage. There's a voluntary crop substitution programme in the peace agreement. There's 30,000 families waiting to sign up to that. There's about 99,000 families registered in that programme, but of those, only 22,000 have received the payments they're supposed to receive, and only a third have received technical assistance. So there needs to be a lot more resources and speed to that programme, and also protection for those leaders, because many of the leaders of those communities are ones being targeted by different groups with interest in continuing the drugs trade. On the issue of paramilitaries, it's obviously a very complicated issue, and it changes according to the regions of Colombia and different economic interests, different political interests. I do think the government has not done enough to stop the climate of kind of hate and stigmatisation of social leaders, and also even the justification of, of some of the killings. The Minister of Defence reacted to the killing of the FARC member that I mentioned, trying to say that there'd been some kind of armed interaction when actually he was, murdered. And the action plan that they've announced, the PAO, which is the timely action plan, which the government has announced as a measure to deal with the killings, doesn't actually include civil society organisations, human rights organisations, opposition groups in the programme in terms of their involvement in creating the programme, whereas the security measures designed in the peace agreement are a whole host of different and complicated institutional measures, legal measures, which very much include those organisations. There's a National Commission of Security Guarantees, and it would be, you know, whilst we wouldn't criticise any effort by the government to try and target these killings, there needs to be more concerted effort made and some of the measures in the agreement implemented. They're also, you know, in terms of the international community, you know, something that I think has caused concern recently was a letter sent by the Foreign Minister to all the diplomatic community in Colombia on the 25th of June, saying that they can no longer visit the ETCRs, the FARC zones of reincorporation, without the government's authority, that they have to explain why they want to go, that they have to coordinate their agenda in conjunction with the government, and even when they're going with the UN mission, it has to be in coordination with the government. That violates, you know, the right of the international community to go and visit these zones, which really they have put a lot of resources into these implementation and reintegration projects. And it's, you know, the FARC has the right to invite the international community to come and see these projects. So I'd also think it's important to keep an eye on that, to make sure the international community has access to these areas, and really urge the Colombian government to stop trying to change the agreement as it was signed, and to put the necessary resources into the implementation, and to try and tackle this climate of polarisation, because there are elements within the administration, elements within the party that is behind the president, which really have been very vociferously against the peace agreement.
Thank you. Deputy Seán Crowe.
Margaret and you're all very welcome this morning. I think what we've heard this morning is a very bleak report. I'd like to be more positive. The release of Huber Ballesteros was a positive. There's positives in relation to the that, in your statement is saying that many Colombians still believe, are still committed to the peace process itself. But as you outline in your own report, many governments and politicians, gave a commitment, and gave a lot of time and energy to the process itself. And listen to your presentation this morning. The suggestion is that it's dying. The process is dying from lack of action, clearly from the government itself. I suppose the key element is land reform, around the resources and so on, and the fact that there's no movement on that. I think that's a huge step back. I suppose one of the biggest difficulties for anyone that was trying to convince those who were involved and engaged in the conflict was that there was a new way forward. There was a possibility of a transitional period that you would move away from conflict. But again, going by the amount of people that are being killed, many of them are human rights activists. Many of them are not ex-combatants, and yet they're being killed. And Kevin was talking in terms of it's still the most dangerous place for trade unions in the world, despite the fact that we have a peace process there. So I suppose the first question is, all those politicians that have, given a commitment to the process in the UN, you talk in terms of UN have a permanent office in Bogota there monitoring the process, what's happening in Colombia, because prior to even the peace agreement. But what can those organisations do now that clearly that the process there's huge difficulties there? And the fact that you've convinced, there was part of what they did was convince people, and many of the people they were trying to convince had been through a process in the past where many people who took a political role had been also slaughtered. I think there was something like 2,000 ex-combatants at that time who stood for elections and were killed. So we seem to be having a repeat of those processes. We've seen. I suppose one of the questions I want to ask is those ex-combatants who were in jail, and that was part of the process. What's happening there in relation to the release of them? What happens when they are released? Is there a programme then for them to reintegrate them into society? Is there the resources being put into? You're saying the land hasn't been supplied, but we've recently, the Irish government have recently opened an embassy in Bogota. Again, you know, embassies around the world where there's been conflict situations or, you know, difficulties with, you know, human rights, they've played a huge role in relation to, say, monitoring what's going on, but also maybe attending trials and you know, involvement in that whole area. How important is that? Would you know, suggest for a new embassy like Ireland, but also the other embassies out there? Do they play a role in that? And I suppose lastly, there's huge concern in relation to, I suppose, one of the areas that has been I've raised here and it's been raised in the chamber, but also other groups have raised in relation to one area they were dealing with regarding Colombia at the moment. Ireland is buying significant, ESB is buying significant amounts of coal from the Cerrejón mine in the northeast of Colombia. And we recently had one of the human rights defenders from that area, one of that works with indigenous people, and she was saying that she met with myself and Maureen O'Sullivan in an informal Foreign Affairs Committee meeting. But again, she was saying that her life was under threat, and since she went back to Colombia again, that threat has been increased. So, you know, I've seen pictures of the mine. It's devastating, the way of life of the indigenous community in that region, and it's causing huge, massive environmental destruction. I just wonder, he is aware of the mine. Members of the local community are coming under threat, some of them being killed by local paramilitaries, and there's been death threats. So, considering land was at the heart of the Colombian conflict, again, it's disturbing to see that the Colombian government continue to facilitate, you know, what the locals there would say, like, there's a company there that has been involved in that for the last 40 years, but there's land grabs going on in the area. People are being forced away from the river, clean water. They're relying on companies to get clean water and food. So, what you know, again, do you see there's a role there for the Irish government in relation to that? Do you believe that the ESB have a responsibility as a company that's buying it? Should they familiarise themselves with what's going on in Colombia? Again, I suppose, do you believe that it would be important maybe for the Irish ambassador to visit that region and, again, going at the connection with Ireland, with the ESB, and to visit the area and just see exactly what's going on the ground? Thank you.
Thanks, Deputy Crowe. Mr. Camden.
Well, Deputy, if we're going to make a general point, and maybe Mariella might deal with some of the specifics. In a short visit to Colombia, obviously it's only possible to get a certain amount of information, but I was particularly struck. We met a panel of human rights lawyers and, you know, some of the religious that are involved in peace and justice. And at the end of that panel, I just asked the question, what could we do? Which I think is really at the heart of what you're saying. And the first thing, and remember this was 2.5 years ago, the need for international monitoring of human rights abuses, the need for the international agencies, including the EU, to remain in Colombia post the agreement to ensure that things were properly monitored, and action now, which was 2.5 years ago, to ensure that the agreement wasn't undermined through persecution, which is what has been happening, and that the funds, international funds, were monitored so that they were channeled directly to the organisations that were working in communities and directly with the reincorporation of guerrillas and, you know, in actual communities. And I think that what we need to do as an international community and as Ireland is to try and drive that process further to ensure that the peace agreement is secured. And the visits of colleagues, various colleagues in the intervening period, would only confirm that that's actually kind of the most useful, I think, thing that we can do. I fully agree with you in terms of your comments about the land question. I was quite struck. I mean, it's a stunningly beautiful country. And in rural Colombia, you know, there are a lot of things that would remind you of, you know, Ireland, even going back 50 years. And obviously at the root cause of the problem is the fact that, you know, there were 8 million hectares of land, you know, dispossessed. There were 7 million displaced people, you know, so land is at the heart of the problem. And that's why the agreement itself was quite specific as to how to deal with, you know, the processes that needed to address the land question. And obviously linked to that was the whole issue around the illicit drugs and crop substitution and so on and so forth. But in relation to your specific questions, I think Mariella would probably be in a better position to answer.
Thanks, Seán. On the bleakness, you know, it is difficult because there are all these challenges, but you want to also give this, you know, the reality is there's a lot of people working very hard to support the implementation of the peace agreement. There's an interesting process called Defendemos la Paz, Defend the Peace, which is a kind of loose alliance of many different people from different political sectors that really politically would be very different, journalists, politicians, human rights defenders that are trying to work to defend the peace agreement and the implementation. There's a big demonstration on the 26th of July being programmed specifically around the killings of leaders. So, you know, I wouldn't want to give an impression that it's just you know, there are, and the agreement is still there, and as I said, it's an official document of the Security Council, and it needs to be reclaimed and protected. You know, there have been the UN Security Council, the verification mission report that was released just last week, you know, did recognise that the territorial plans, the cadets, have been established now, and that some more projects for reincorporation have been agreed. You know, so there's some small areas where you can see some efforts, but I think, and also it is important to say that thousands of lives have been saved from the end of combat between the FARC and the army. You know, that is something to be recognised. But I think, you know, the overwhelming sense for a lot of people is, you know, what you say, that there's a lack of will in many areas, and that the killings really are alarming. The FARC has got that history, as you mentioned, of the Patriotic Union Party, where in a previous attempt at a peace process they entered the political process, and it was actually over 4,000 members of the party that were assassinated, many elected members of Congress, councillors, mayors, etc. So that is the last experience they have of entering the political process, and obviously with the local elections, you know, that's something that's alarming. One of the leaders of the FARC yesterday said that, you know, he had information that there was a plan to be systematically killing members of the FARC. So there is a lot of concern, and a lot of the security measures, you know, that they're calling for aren't just bodyguards and armoured cars. It's collective protection, and it's also fundamentally changing the whole political, you know, the use of weapons in politics, which has been used in Colombia historically. In terms of the international, the other thing I would say is that the FARC members in the regions, you know, if there's not sustainable economic projects for them to be involved in, the peace agreement hasn't got rid of the illegal economy or the other armed groups, you know, so there's a criminal offer there where people can, you know, be tempted when they don't have sustainable ways of making a living. And in terms of the Irish Embassy, I think it was, established in January. Ireland, obviously, with the history of the peace process, as I said, you know, the Colombians have greatly benefited from that experience. If Ireland does end up in the Security Council, then it would also be a very important role that it would have in terms of the mandate on the UN verification mission. The Security Council is visiting Colombia, I think, tomorrow, and those kinds of visits are very important. And making sure that the agenda is balanced, that they have access to all sectors of Colombian society. I think in terms of the mine, it is a region where many Indigenous children from the Wayuu community have died because of malnutrition. There's huge issues in that region. We've had, you know, contact with the union as well that tries to organise workers in that mine. And I think any kind of visit from the diplomatic community to the regions is incredibly important for them to see things firsthand, for them to have access to the communities and direct access. And I think Ireland has, you know, the Irish Embassy has a big role to play there. The EU has, you know, a group of ambassadors that focus on human rights defenders, so things like inviting human rights defenders to the embassy, supporting human rights initiatives, all of those are really important initiatives, and really pushing for support for the transitional justice process as well.
Thank you. Senator Ivana Bacik.
Chair, and you're very welcome, and thank you for the very comprehensive presentations, and welcome also to the Colombian ambassador. I'm just struck by the comment about the bleak assessment, but as you say, Ms. Cohen, it's really important, I suppose, to try and take a balanced approach. That it's not. I think to characterise it as a dying peace agreement would be a mistake. And I'm struck by the recent European Parliament report we've been given on Colombia, given that by Coit Hayes from the Oireachtas EU unit, and a report from May 2019, which talks about a fragile stability in Colombia and talks about the challenges in the peace process, but certainly tries to pave a way forward. And I think that's what we should be trying to do. We heard in recent months from the EU Special Envoy Eamon Gilmore, who addressed this committee, as you know, and who spoke with us about the challenges and about his continuing work. And thank you, Mr. Callanan, for paying tribute to Eamon Gilmore and his continued role with the EU. And of course, it's also very positive to see the Irish Embassy opening in Bogota, our Ambassador Alison Milton, as you said, and the assistance and support that Ireland and Irish officials have given to the peace process. And just also to pay tribute to the important work your own organisation, Justice for Colombia, has been doing. I think the EU Parliament report makes clear the hugely significant role that civil society and NGOs will have in ensuring the implementation of the peace accord. But I am struck by the appalling news about the deaths of so many human rights defenders, by the statement you've made that Colombia is the most dangerous country in the world to be a trade unionist. That's pretty bleak. And of course, I think all of us following the situation have been alarmed at President Duque and his government's apparent lack of commitment to the peace accord. So I suppose the question for us as Oireachtas representatives on the committee is how to help in implementation of the peace accord, how to use any influence we have in terms of pressure on Colombian state and the Colombian government. On how we can work through the EU, which has, of course, a hugely important trust fund for peace, which has been very instrumental in the negotiations on the peace accord and in trying to see it implemented. The briefing we've received from the Department of Foreign Affairs points out, of course, that Duque's government is a coalition government, so that there are different views in the different parties to that government. So perhaps it's not quite as monolithic as might appear sometimes in reports. So, how can we use our influence? We've typically or often in this committee expressed our views in a letter to the Taoiseach, asked him by way of writing, and Chair, we might do that again today, asked him to use any influence he has at the EU level and in bilateral contacts as well to try and push for implementation of the peace process. A few key points, I suppose, and key questions I would have, apart from those general observations. First, like Deputy O'Sullivan, I was struck by the fact that one enormous difficulty has been the pillar on illicit drugs, on the issue of drug cultivation, and juxtaposed with the Christian Aid report today, suggesting that the war on drugs has been the wrong approach to take. It's a view personally I've taken for a long time. The EU Parliament report notes that while more needs to be done to eradicate the cultivation of illegal crops, they point out that the strategies that have been adopted and indeed are continuing to be adopted in Colombia, these strategies have been ineffective, and a joint report by a number of think tanks and prominent NGOs has demonstrated their ineffectiveness and has called for a different policy that includes a focus on rights and public health and that moves away from the prohibitionist war on drugs strategy. So I wonder, can you comment on that? Is there any way, again, that we can use influence to try and put forward an alternative approach to the problem of illegal drugs that would help to resolve that issue? I think also one of the issues identified in the EU Parliament report and in our own government's assessment of the situation is the recent deteriorating situation in Venezuela, the destabilising effect that is having within Colombia, with estimates around tens of thousands of refugees coming into Colombia every day across the border. I've heard that from friends who visited Colombia in recent months who tell me this is a very visible issue and clearly hugely problematic. So can you comment on that? The EU Parliament report suggests that tackling the implications of the Venezuelan crisis is one of the key interventions that needs to be made in ensuring the effective implementation of the peace accord. And dealing with the ongoing security issue from the ELN, the guerrilla group which hasn't been party to the peace accord and which I think was responsible for a bomb attack in Bogota just in January of this year. Can you comment on that? I think peace talks are continuing in Havana but have been suspended at various periods, and whether there's any prognosis there. And again, we spoke with Eamon Gilmore about that issue too, and he pointed out some key challenges from that. And I suppose finally, just to reiterate, you know, our commitment, I think all of us on a cross-party basis, to ensure that the fragile stability currently pertaining in Colombia is supported, and that we can try and help in any way we can to ensure the implementation of the peace accord, to ensure continued peace and protection of human rights, the end to the dreadful assassinations and deaths of so many human rights defenders in Colombia, and support for victims. And one of the positive things that shone out to me from any reports I've been reading is that victims and families have participated. I mean, you talked about the JEP and the transitional justice process, how important that has been, that is working. That to some, clearly it's being undermined, but that there are some positive signs there, and that one of the positive signs has been the participation by very brave victims and their families. So, you know, and the support from the Colombian people, albeit that this is a very polarised population, and clearly as exemplified in the vote on the referendum on the peace deal itself, and in President Santos having lost the 2018 election. But you know, so this is it's a massive issue. But while it does appear a bleak assessment currently, can we see a way forward, and can we assist in that in a positive way? Thank you.
Thanks, Senator. Sorry, apologies from the chair. He's had to go into the chamber and he will be back shortly. So, Mariella or Kevin?
Thank you. I'll try and pick up as many points as I can. Just on the victims, just because that was the last thing that was in my head. I agree. I think when you look at the attacks on the JEP, they rarely come from victims. You know, they're coming from people that have either been implicated in things that they don't want to be discovered, or for political reasons. You've actually seen a lot of support for the transitional justice process from the victims. And they're not just victims of the FARC, that this process is for victims of everyone in the conflict, you know, and it's sometimes been kind of misrepresented what this transitional process is for. And actually it's the one area where, after all the lessons that we facilitated learning from the Good Friday Agreement, is the one area where maybe Colombia's advanced more in terms of legacy, truth, you know, some of the, in the agreement, maybe not in practice yet, but I think it's, you know, internationally it's been hugely regarded, that whole process, and the focus on restorative justice, the focus on truth rather than a punitive process. And some civil society organisations have made presentations to the system, Afro-Colombians and Indigenous, women, victims, relatives of victims of the extrajudicial execution killings by the army. So I would agree, you know, victims are supposed to be at the heart of this peace agreement, and it really is important to defend that process. On the ELN, the talks are suspended since the bomb that they took ownership of in a police academy school in January. The government called off the talks. Obviously, from, you know, civil society and those defenders of the peace process, they're very keen for talks to resume and some kind of peaceful negotiated resolution to be found with the ELN, because although they aren't as large as the FARC were, it's a significant, you know, force that needs to be, there needs to be a peaceful resolution to that process. In terms of Venezuela, it is difficult in terms of the amount of migrants on the border region. Particularly, we took a delegation to Catatumbo, which borders Venezuela last year, and it's something you do hear about. But I would say, you know, defenders of the peace process don't necessarily agree with the kind of Duque's administration kind of interventionist approach or any kind of moves towards any kind of conflict. Obviously, the implication of that for the peace process would be very difficult. So, again, there's concerns, but support for negotiations and for things to be resolved through negotiations. In terms of the war on drugs and the coca crop issue, really I would say to encourage the government to implement what's in the agreement is a way of solving it. You know, there's a clear roadmap in there, there's a public health focus in there as well in terms of users, there's a focus on, you know, sustainable alternatives that don't damage the environment, for peasant farmers to have, to be empowered to have the technical, the subsistence, there needs to be development in the countryside. So when you then see the National Development Plan and the lack of resources being given to developing the countryside, obviously the PDETs, which I mentioned, that were mentioned in the UN report, is a welcome step, but there needs to be more investment in the countryside, and the agreement was a very progressive way of dealing with the drugs issue that was welcomed by a lot of people that work on this issue in more detail. In terms of the government, I agree it's not homogenous. The Centro Democrático, the party itself, has got different views within it, and it is a challenging situation, particularly with the history of the party having been so opposed to the peace agreement to then be responsible for implementing it. But I would reiterate the fact that this is an agreement signed by a state, not by an administration, and as such, it has an obligation to implement it, and the agreement needs to be protected. In terms of the international community and what you could do, I think a visit would be incredibly important if that's something that you can do, and making sure you have independence and being able to meet with all the different institutions, with civil society, with the signatories to the agreement. And I would say that as well in terms of the FARC, that in the context of the peace process, they're a signatory to this agreement. They're not just another political party now, In terms of the funding, obviously the EU Trust Fund and all the support that's been given has been hugely important. I would always say the political support is almost more important than the resources issue. I think the backing for the agreement, the pressure that can be put in the diplomatic ways that you need to find to do it would be important. Statements, letters. The statements that have been made by the Security Council every 3 months defending the HEP and the autonomy have been hugely significant, and I do think some of the progress is down to that international shield that has been given, that international presence, and the UN verification mission is fundamental, and its continuation. Its mandate is due to be renewed in September, and that continuation of the mission is hugely important in terms of a presence on the ground, and people really do feel that as a kind of shield. So I think anything you can do to build that feeling of international presence is important. Thank you.
Just to maybe add to that, one further thing that I think would be open to this committee would be to invite the parties here to present, and rather than everybody have to go to Colombia, but you could, I think, very usefully issue an invitation to the parties.
Okay, thank you.
Just to clarify, an interesting point. The parties from
the agreement,
Yes.
so to the Colombian state government and to the FARC.
Okay.
Deputy Collins.
Thanks, Chair. My apologies for being late. I caught most of your opening statement on the monitor in my office. Most of what I wanted to ask has already been addressed. Just in terms of I suppose the international trade union movement, how is the message that you're giving us here today? How is that being received and being acted upon in other countries around the world? The stronger, the countries with the more stronger open democracies who have or should have more interest in this. Is that being well received, and is it being acted upon? And also, what's the, because it's so, I suppose, removed from us here, what's the mood among, the population within Colombia? I mean, we see an uprising in Venezuela, okay, for different reasons, obviously, but this is coming from the ground up. Where is all of this with the ordinary man and woman in Colombia? Are they so suppressed or oppressed that they just feel they can't rise up and challenge their leaders and their leadership? And also, are the religious and the churches, are they playing enough of a role, and are they having an impact in it? Thanks.
Thank you. In terms of the trade union movement, I think there is a lot of awareness, and I think Justice for Colombia played a role in building that awareness in the trade union movement. The ITUC, as I said, just published its Global Rights Index report, just like 2 weeks ago, and they do list Colombia as, you know, amongst the 10 worst countries for workers and the most killings of trade unionists there. And I know that ITUC has been, you know, working on trying to raise the profile of Colombia. And then significant, you know, the TUC obviously has Colombia as a priority country. I know the Irish Congress also has done a lot of work on Colombian trade unionists. And the AFL-CIO in the US has also done a lot of work, particularly related to the US-Colombia trade agreement and the provisions that were in there, the Labour Action Plan to improve labour rights, human rights, and to tackle some of the impunity and some of the failings being seen in reaching those targets as the roadmap in the EU trade agreement. During that time of the negotiation of the EU-Colombia trade agreement, there was widespread movement amongst the European trade union movement. You know, several sector federations had motions, the ETUC was very active in trying to get binding benchmarks to be met regarding labour rights and human rights ahead of the agreement, which eventually wasn't successful to have a binding one. There's a roadmap, but we see, unfortunately, many of those targets not having been met yet. So I think it is definitely a big issue for the trade union movement internationally. In terms of the general population, I think it's fair to say it's very polarised. You know, I think there's been a lot of misinformation about what the peace agreement is, and I guess that's why I started off by saying the agreement wasn't for the FARC, it was for the Colombian people. And I would say the previous administration under Santos, despite, you know, his commitment to the peace agreement, I think there was a lacking of work, of pedagogy done by the previous administration in really trying to show why the peace agreement was beneficial for the people of Colombia and not let it be sidelined by kind of extremist opposition to the agreement, as this is just about the FARC getting to be in Congress and the FARC getting off from their crimes and being able to have impunity. You know, and I think that discourse has entered the mainstream in a very damaging way to the peace process. There are sectors that, you know, as I said, on the 26th of July, there's going to be this mobilisation, but I wouldn't say there's mass mobilisation in defence of the agreement. There was around the time of the referendum, and there's this new process that I mentioned in terms of a kind of general support for the cross-party, you know, and cross-civil society politician support for the peace agreement, which is a very new thing and very interesting that people have been able to overcome their political differences to defend the agreement. So I think there is hope there, coming back to your point. On the churches, during the time of the referendum, some of the church figures were against the peace agreement being ratified because of the equalities and gender component, which again is a historic thing of the peace agreement, to have a gender and equalities focus cross-cutting throughout the peace agreement. And there was some misinformation about it being, you know, a target to the traditional family and that it would a gender ideology, and some of the evangelical churches kind of campaigned against the peace agreement on those grounds, but then several of those pastors actually came out to Havana, met with the FARC, met with the government, were explained the gender process, you know, and it was quite interesting to see some of the shift there. And there are some very well-known Catholic Church as well representatives in this broad alliance supporting the peace process. So there's been a mix. The church played a role in monitoring the ELN talks as well.
Just a supplementary.
Yeah, sure.
Just following on from the churches, what about big business, you know, banking, industry, because it's obviously a huge economy on another level. Is there any movement which has corporate responsibility at its core from what we've got here, say IBEC, who represents the business community or the bigger business? Is there any equivalent out there? I'm sure there is. And are they trying to play any obvious overt active role in terms of trying to address the issues?
During the Santos administration, there was a really interesting group of high-profile, prominent business people promoting the peace agreement that played a very important role in trying to get the business community behind the process. I think that group, I'm not sure how active it is currently in the new administration. I think the UN mission has done really interesting work at a regional level with local businesses, trying to engage them in supporting reintegration projects and trying to see the economic benefits of peace. I'm not an expert on it, but that's as far as I know, and I know the UN has done some interesting work to try and promote that. Yeah.
Kevin, do you want to?
Yes, Deputy, just on the international trade union aspect, as we've heard, Colombia is the most dangerous country in the world to be a trade unionist, and my own union is supporting this Peace Monitor project, and as part of that we've had a number of delegations, and on one of the delegations last year, alongside one of my senior colleagues, we had the General Secretary of the International Trade Union Confederation, Sharon Burrows. So I think, we are, spreading the message, I think, through the various confederations, including the global one.
Thank you. Where am I? Well, I have to admit, Colombia is not a country that I am fully au fait with, and I think it's important to be honest and say that work needs to be done in informing people on a wider basis as to the situation if we are interested in trying to find a resolution. And I am, for one, I'm particularly interested in assisting in trying to find a resolution. And I'm delighted to welcome you here. I think this is a first. I'm in this Parliament since 1981, which is a long time. And it's the first time, I have to say, Chairperson, that I've ever heard any sort of a debate or discussion at this level about Colombia. It's something that for a country like Ireland that developed through, being under the fist of the British for so long and establishing our own independence and so on, I think we've an awful lot to give to a country like Colombia based on our experience. And I take the point you make. At parliamentary level, I think it's vitally important, whether it's us going to Colombia or Colombia coming to us, is not the important thing once we get together somehow as politicians, as elected politicians, and listen to people like your good selves in informing us. But I think creating awareness of a situation like this is so important. And I would only be too pleased to welcome a delegation here, because I think you learn more by bringing people to a place that they can see for themselves as to how we've developed as distinct from us going and, I'm not saying that we shouldn't go, but I say the first thing that should be done is try and get people here to show and talk like we are now about where we've come from and the difficulties we had. And we had many difficulties on the road to establishing where we are today. And, I think we've been fortunate that we were brought along with the European Union. We became part of a bigger enterprise, if you like, and it has brought us along. And also that, as a tradition, Irish people have travelled an awful lot abroad and have gained a lot of experience. So I really do believe that we have something to offer to a country like Colombia. And I would strongly recommend that, whether it's an invitation from this committee or whatever should happen, I think it is important that we invite a delegation to discuss the future development and to learn from, and I'm not being big-headed about this, but I do believe that we have a lot to offer in terms of a developing democracy, modern democracy here in Ireland. So I would certainly welcome a delegation if that could be possible. And I think there is a need. Eamon Gilmore is a constituency colleague of mine, and I'm delighted that he is taking such an interest, and he has an awful lot to offer, and I would like to think that we would support his efforts in every way we possibly can. But it's, as a member of this committee, I think it's vitally important that we are informed on a regular basis and that we're not afraid to give an opinion without being sort of dictatorial. But so I would very much welcome a delegation coming here where we can sit down like we are now and discussing problems with some maybe a pre-arranged agenda so that there'll be some structure to the. But I think we could assist in the development of what's happening because of our experience, and I think we should share that.
Thank you. Before I let you back in, just to clarify, I mean, we did have a meeting with Eamon Gilmore when he was giving an update on that, and we have had some informal meetings. I know I certainly was at one that the Colombian ambassador to Britain was attended with us, again, to fill us in. And also we've had a number of informal meetings with groups, and I was just going to ask you before I bring in Senator Gavin, one of the really ones that struck me were the Guardians of the River when they came to visit us from the Choco region, and I suppose that would be my question after Senator Gavin on the environment and environmental issues. So Senator Gavin.
Thanks indeed, and thanks for allowing me. I'm a guest here this morning as well. I want to pay tribute to Justice for Colombia. I was fortunate enough to be part of the most recent delegation. And I want to pay particular tribute to the Force of Trade Union because it's so significant, I think, the support that your union is giving to this incredible civil society organisation. And they really are punching at a very high level, because one of the most significant things from our visit was the fact that the Colombian government felt the need to meet with us at the end of the week. And I thought that was very significant and in its own way, very positive. I want to share just very briefly, if I may, Chair, a couple of the quotes, because we did meet a whole range of people from trade unions, social leaders, community leaders. It's a very moving week, actually, because it is such a beautiful country, but the level of oppression there is quite shocking, frankly. One of the human rights defenders said to me directly, "We're witnessing a genocide of social trade union leaders and human rights defenders." I mean, that's a shocking statement to hear. Perhaps the saddest statement was from Ada Avella, who was a Member of Parliament for the Patriotic Union Party. She's, like myself, a lifelong trade unionist. She said, "There aren't so many trade unionists killed lately, but then there aren't so many of us left." What an absolutely shocking statement to make. I was disturbed by what Mariella told us in terms of the new restrictions on visiting the transition zones, because we visited Tierra Grata in the northeast of Colombia, in the La Paz district, and we could see firsthand that the potential is here to deliver something significant economically in terms of independence, but it just isn't happening for lack of support. And it was disturbing that when we raised it with the government in that meeting at the end of the week, effectively we were met with denial. And I found that disappointing. And the other thing is, I suppose I speak as an Irish Republican, I didn't hear the language of a peace process from the government ministers. And I found that particularly disturbing. We were first-hand witnesses, and yet we were told that we were effectively, I think the word lies was used a number of times. And I just didn't hear that language that we would expect from a peace process, and indeed what we would hear from our own peace process, despite the challenges from time to time. Perhaps the most moving part of the mission, though, was to visit Cajibio, a town in North Cauca, because what we saw there in a community setting was pictures on the wall of local community leaders who'd been murdered in the last couple of years, young men, many of them members of the Fensuagro Agricultural Trade Union. And I have to say, I won't name the Irish company, but this community setting was surrounded by property owned by an Irish company, and they said to us that the paramilitaries were using the land to come out in the dark to attack and kill their people. And as an Irishman, I found that particularly disturbing. We had a very positive meeting with Alison Milton, and one of the things she did commit to do was to go and visit that mine. And if I may be so bold to suggest that a further action for this committee might be just to write to the ambassador to ask her about that visit. Has it taken place, and what are our views on it? Because as my colleague Sean said, and by the way, Sean sends his apologies, he had to go to Parliament. I mean, really, we as a country should not be importing blood coal and I did note that in a recent response, the Taoiseach did indicate he'd have a further look at this, and I really hope he does, because it's very much not in keeping with a lot of the very good work, in fairness, that's being done by Ireland. I want to just finish by asking a couple of questions. The first is, you mentioned the local elections in October, and that was a big topic when we were over there. How can these elections be free and fair, or how free and fair are they likely to be, given that we met people, and you've mentioned it yourself, telling us that they're being threatened, their lives are being threatened. Very hard to run an election when people's lives are being threatened. And again, as a number of people have said, it's just struck me that there's a vacuum where the defence of leaders should be. There's a gaping vacuum. And again, I have to say, particularly the representatives of the Justice Department and the police, there just seem to be a denial. And yet the facts are there, the facts are in terms of that. And that leads on to the second question. And it's a difficult question, and perhaps I'm asking for an opinion. But in terms of the FARC members being killed by right-wing paramilitaries, these paramilitaries are acting with impunity. That's very clear. The question I want to ask is, are they also acting in collusion with the state? I think that's it, Chair. I just want to thank Justice for Colombia for giving me the opportunity to go out there. I really do hope that our Irish government really does speak with a strong, loud voice, and I would acknowledge the work of Eamon Gilmore as well, by the way, in relation to this issue, because I have to say, just on a personal human level, I found it deeply shocking to meet people whose relatives are killed, and this is not something the deaths, the number of deaths are increasing. The number of deaths have been increasing since the peace process was signed. Very hard to keep a peace process going when one side are being slaughtered. Thank you.
Sure. Right, Mariella.
So, on the delegations, I would just add to the tribute paid to Forza for supporting the Peace Monitor delegations. One feature of the delegations is that they're meeting everyone, and I would recognise the government for having engaged with those delegations, the embassy in London, and the ministers meeting at the highest level. That's been incredibly valued, that there's been that engagement, and I think it gives credibility to the delegation that they're meeting with everyone, the HEP, the UN, the institutions, the parties. In terms of the environment, I think there's concerns around the extractive industries and the impact that's having on the environment. You heard about the mine, and that licences be given respecting the indigenous land and Afro-Colombian land that's constitutionally provided for, the respect for those lands. There's campaigns around fracking as well, and obviously the concern around the possible fumigation of crops with glyphosate, which is incredibly toxic. Yeah. So there are concerns around the environment. On the elections, I think obviously having international observers would be incredibly important, but one of the concerns sometimes is the observers come, just a day before, and the problem in Colombia isn't just about the day of the election, it's about what happens before the election. It's about the violence, intimidation that comes in the build-up to an election. And as I said, the MOE, and I can send through their report, the Electoral Observer Mission, they released a report in May, at the end of May, saying that since last October, 5 mayoral candidates and 2 aspiring council members were amongst the 75 registered political assassinations, and that 37 political activists had survived assassination attempts. So I think the elections come in a context of what's happened before, and I think there needs to be attention put on that issue, and maybe some monitoring, at this stage. Obviously for the FARC, it's the first time they'll be participating in the local elections, and they'll be quite exposed, so that's going to be very difficult. So I'm not sure, I think the EU, has sent observations before and elections previously, so it would be important to see what kind of monitoring can take place. And obviously the UN mission has a mandate for the to verify the political reincorporation of the FARC, so they will be monitoring the situation as well. In terms of the collusion, I would say all the different killings of the members of the FARC obviously vary. In some cases, it has been directly the army, like the case of Dimar Torres that I mentioned. Other cases, it's been ELN, paramilitary groups, maybe linked to dissidents as well. So it's a very complex, and it does depend on the region as well. And some of them would be clearly, politically motivated. Others would be not sure, what the reasons would be. I think the importance is about, obviously, where there has been the state involvement for those to be brought to justice. I think the whole issue of paramilitaries, in the peace agreement, there's a special investigative unit that's supposed to be set up to dismantle and investigate the paramilitaries. There was a huge back and forth with the former Attorney General over this unit, because the whole point of the unit was to be completely autonomous, and it had to then be created under the Attorney General's office because his opposition to it, and it would be important to support that unit to have its autonomy to actually investigate and dismantle the paramilitary groups, and also to look at the political. There was supposed to be kind of a political pact across the country in terms of taking violence out of politics, in terms of changing the hate, and the HEP has a role there in terms of the reconciliation as well. So it all, one key feature of the peace agreement is that it's comprehensive and it's interlinked, and if you start chipping away and taking bits, other bits don't work, so you have to implement it as a whole. If the FARC members don't have legal guarantees, then why would they offer the truth? So there's all these kind of questions that need to be, the government needs to see the agreement as a whole. And just to reiterate what Kevin said in terms of hosting both parties, we think, any opportunity for signatories to the agreement to be recognised as such and to give their views would be really valuable.
Sorry, there's just one quick supplemental, Chair, before we finish. I just noticed when I was over there that President Duque is on record as supporting Nicasio Martinez to be the new head of the army. This is a man accused of serious human rights abuses. I just wondered, again, it's a very disturbing message to be sending. Just wondered if you had any views on that.
Yeah, there have been concerns. There was a New York Times report in May that highlighted that there was a return to the combat, kind of a pressure on soldiers to report wins in combat, and that obviously in the past those incentives under the Uribe administration had led to the extrajudicial scandal where thousands of civilians were murdered by soldiers and presented as if they were guerrillas killed in combat and received promotions and bonuses in reward. So there was a big kind of scandal around this piece. I understand the Minister of Defence took back some of those orders and reformed some of them, but there's still some there that are concerning. And this particular general had been implicated in some of those crimes, so there was a lot of concern that he was being promoted, and actually the opposition parties tried to block that in the Congress. It is very concerning, and the whole kind of doctrine within the military of the internal enemy and enemy of the state is something that was discussed a lot, during the peace talks about having to change the culture and the army becoming a protector of the people.
And Kevin, would you like to conclude? Okay, and Sarah, would you like to contribute? Okay. Okay, so Chair, we're finishing. Will I continue or let's back? Okay, well look, the presentation was very grim, and the issues have been highlighted for us. I think also in the middle of the grimness we saw positives, and I think we have to really work on those, and you've given us certainly suggestions for the committee that we can do in moving forward. So on behalf of the Joint Committee, I'd like to thank you for your presentation here today and for dealing with our questions in such a comprehensive manner. So the meeting is now stands adjourned sine die. Thank you very much. All right.